Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Osina Corbin, a member of BFSA, Black Faculty and Staff Association, and the Administrative Support Coordinator for the Psychology Department in the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, also known as CLASS. If you haven't already, please be sure to sign in for our records. Please join me in thanking staff members who worked hard behind the scenes to put the event together. Melissa Ortiz, Lydia Dolan, and Ashley Bagwell, and representatives from the bookstore who joined us today in case you need to purchase your copy of the book we are celebrating. As many of you know, Cal Poly Pomona has honored Black History Month with a series of events aimed to engage, educate, and celebrate the rich contributions of the Black community. What better way to wrap up this month's celebrations with a look towards building a Black future. To that end, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Christopher Paul Harris, Assistant Professor of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Harris earned his PhD in politics and historical studies from the New School for Social Research. Prior to joining the faculty of UC Irvine, he held a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of African American Studies of Northwestern University. His research aims to understand the political lives, thought, and cultures of the Black diaspora and the underlying social forces that shape them. Dr. Harris's book, To Build a Black Future, The Radical Politics of Joy, Pain, and Care, draws upon his experiences as an activist and organizer to take readers inside the movement of Black lives. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harris.
How you guys doing today? I'm doing well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Davia, class, and the Black Faculty Association for having me. I'm honored to be here. It's still a little bit surreal to walk into a room and see a book with my name on it around, but the book's been out for almost 6 months now, and I feel like the world's a completely different place than it was in September when it came out, and I think I'm gonna reflect on that a little bit. But first, to give a brief overview of the book, To Build a Black Future is a meditation on Black life and Black struggle through the prism of Black movement, both present and past. The book narrates and theorizes the political culture of the movement for Black lives, a political culture anchored by the assertion that all Black lives should and do matter, and that operates from what I argue is a threefold premise. 1, we must regard Black pain. 2, we must champion Black joy. And lastly, we must practice a radically inclusive ethics of care. Mediated by social media, the movement's response to and regard for the hypervisibility of Black pain and death has enabled and mobilized a self-conception that is unapologetically Black. To be Black unapologetically is a militant appeal to the most expansive understanding of what Blackness can mean, rather than one that seeks to police and control, which has been the case in earlier instances of Black struggle. But it's also imbued with and arguably defined by the creative dynamism of Black joy as both a capacious embodiment of Black presence and a prefigurative politics forecasting a society free of anti-Blackness. The mobilization of an unapologetic Black joy directly confronts and regards the specter of Black pain as one of Western modernity's founding principles, the mirror through which the logic of white sense is reflected and confirmed, white sense being the everyday language of law and order, civility, reform, and progress that shield racial violence. While doing so, the movement promotes a political culture premised on a radically inclusive ethics of care. Care, in this case, assumes the role of counter-civilizational force, pushing us away from liberalism and capitalist social relations towards otherwise possibilities. So there's obviously more that I could say about the book, but I hope that the gloss of its framework I just offered will make it easier for those who haven't read it yet to see how what I'm going to speak about today fits into the book's overall tapestry, while also in some ways exceeding it. And speaking of that kind of exceeding the book's frames, given the unrelenting and largely indiscriminate violence that's taking place across Gaza over the past 4 months, it seems appropriate for me to speak specifically on the subject of pain and regard. We're living in a moment of sharpening contradictions. I'm sure all of you can see that, which invites a fundamental question that is important for us, especially in spaces like this. We always have to ask ourselves, how do we as students and as scholars participate in the urgency of now? How do we hold on to the need to participate in that urgency during times when, on the surface, the contradictions appear less sharp? We could probably say that the contradictions appeared less sharp prior to October, right? Looking back, I think that I might have been having this in mind when I wrote the book, right? And to me, to write about Black movement taught me that writing is a responsibility, right? And today, I hope to share a little bit from the book about that responsibility, again, thinking specifically about the idea of pain on the one hand and regard on the other. So this section is called the driver's seat and the hold. Stay with me. These are the first audible words of the Facebook live stream capturing the last moments of Philando Castile's life. 3 words entangled with a sharp cry that briefly cuts across the car. Both the words and the cry must compete with the indecipherable growl of a police officer unseen yet evidenced in Castile's breathless tremor and his blood-stained shirt. Addressing the camera is Diamond Reynolds, the dying man's girlfriend and the mother of the 4-year-old girl sitting in the back seat. At this point, we do not see the child's face, but the divide between the front and back is wide enough for Castile's slouched body to break through the imaginary plane that separates our sight from hers. As a result, the girl is forced into early proximity to the gratuitous violence committed against the Black body, a long acknowledged horror emanating from the days of the slave ship and the auction block, a time when the law itself made clear that Black people were valuable only to the extent their labor could be accumulated and exploited. With Castile's killing, in other words, she is made witness to the systemic distribution of Black pain, its sights, sounds, and smells, its relationship to her own body and that of those around her. Saidiya Hartman might call this moment the origin of the subject, the first recognition of living in and being vulnerable to an anti-Black world for a 4-year-old who, seconds before, might have still been capable of imagining otherwise. A Black girl's childhood robbed of its innocence. "Mom," the 4-year-old pleads, "please stop saying cusses and screaming because I don't want you to get shooted." Obviously, the girl is a quick study. She now realizes her mother could be shot for doing nothing more than expressing anger and grief. Not only was this child within arm's reach of Castile's murder, a trauma in and of itself, she also seemed to understand the arbitrariness of their circumstance, the assumption of criminality so closely linked to anti-Blackness and so often carried out in the name of the law. In this respect, the police radio correspondence that preceded the traffic stop is telling. "I'm going to stop a car. I'm going to check IDs. I have reason to pull it over," the voice on the radio explains. The 2 occupants just look like people that were involved in a robbery. The driver looks more like one of our suspects, just because of the wide-set nose. The officer's use of racial codes is hard to mistake. They're also unsurprising. People of African descent, Frederick Douglass explained over 150 years ago, carry in front the evidence which marks them for persecution. The logic of anti-Black persecution, the chain that links Castile's car to the hold of the slave ship, is simple. They are Negroes, and that is enough. His wide-set nose is the evidence that marks and justifies the indignity and violence soon to come. It makes Castile's spectacular Black death coherent. With this as her reality, Reynolds reports live from the scene. We got pulled over for a busted taillight in the back, and the police just, he's covered. He just killed my boyfriend. Now, at this point, Castile is visibly not dead, but Reynolds seems to subconsciously understand how things will end, just as we already know the ending. The camera oscillates between her face, shaken and steady, a pain-ridden, dying Castile, and the gun pointed inside the car by an increasingly frantic police officer. Castile's audible agony grows louder, but the viewer's attention is drawn to Reynolds. She remains the focal point. Even as she steers the narrative, her words are bound to the legality of Castile's situation and actions. She tries to pull him from the criminality he has been assigned and into the realm of law-abiding citizen. He's licensed. He's licensed to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm. The officer interrupts this report, gun still drawn, and makes an absurd attempt to reassert an authority that has long been lost. Ma'am, just keep your hands where they are. But Reynolds has already refused to comply. By pressing play on the camera and by walking the viewer through what happened, she had made clear that what occurred and is occurring represents a violation and that she will not accept it. This drains him of everything but his power to enact violence and provokes the performative submissiveness in the calm of her reply. Okay, sir, I will. No worries. Consider for a moment the casualness of the words no worries, delivered as if someone was telling her they'd be late for dinner. Consider also, and in juxtaposition, what those words trigger. With heavy breath and his gun bearing down, the officer lets loose a garbled scream. Fuck! This crudely delivered response is not merely an act of desperation and recognition that he has just shot and, as we later learn, killed Castile. Nor is it an acknowledgement that ultimately the events were inevitable, that Officer Geronimo Yanez, who is Latino, had been trained either formally in the police academy or socially in the world to proceed as if Castile, like all Black people, posed an imminent threat. And regardless of the perception of danger, is otherwise subject to violence, often with impunity, anytime and anywhere. Instead, the video suggests that it's Reynolds' announcement of a premature Black death, "He just killed my boyfriend," her witness and testimony, which makes the moment visceral for Yanez. In doing so, Reynolds presents to us and to the archive a narrative from a Black woman unmuted in the face of not only her present subjugation, but also the quotidian violence that marks the Black experience. The terrible spectacle from which she speaks, the viral Black body in pain, is in this case secondary to the act of speaking itself, to the refusal her testimony represents, and to the cruel reality it outlines. Reynolds continues her address to the camera, deepening the detail. He shot his arm off. We got pulled over on Lopinter. Yanez, still frantic, meets her calm with a fruitless effort to justify what we know to be beyond justification. I told him not to reach for it. I told him to get his hands out of it. But Reynolds will not accept this reasoning, and her defiance, exacted through explanation, further undermines his position. You told him to get his ID, sir, his driver's license. Of course, there's no possible response for Yanez except to keep his gun trained on Reynolds through the window, and so he does. As if in counterpoint, Yanez's breath grows heavier as Castile's grows quiet, a split second long enough to allow the gravity of the situation to weigh on Reynolds. Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead. Disturbed only by a second, "Oh fuck," bellowed by Yanez, Reynolds again addresses the camera, directly and with steel. Please don't tell me my boyfriend just went like that. Once more, Yanez attempts to reassert his authority. Just keep your hands where they are, please. But this demand does not break the stride of the narration. Yes, I will, sir. I'll keep my hands where they are, Reynolds responds, but then immediately continues where she left off. Now, however, the target is direct. She's addressing the heavens for a miracle we know will not come. Please don't tell me this, Lord. Please, Jesus, don't tell me that he's gone. Please don't tell me that he's gone. The camera circles back to Castile and remains there, but it's Reynolds we hear and feel. This is a story about both of them, told through her witness. It's a story about how white supremacy ruptures Black bonds and shatters Black lives. It's a story about the way these lives and bonds are always available to be shattered and ruptured. Please, officer, don't tell me that you just did this to him, she asks as her emotions ramp up. Switching from sorrowful plea to a pointed accusation, the assault of the officer's supposed legitimacy continues. You shot 4 bullets into him, sir. He was just getting his license and registration, sir. The words you and sir exemplify her refusal and her witness, as well as their limits. She'll observe Giannis's authority by addressing him as sir, but the pointed you marks Giannis as both perpetrator in actuality and the symbolic carrier of anti-blackness. It allows Reynolds to partially subvert the power dynamic and at that moment turns sir into an ironic gesture of judgment. With this gesture, the scene begins to shift as the additional officers are heard approaching in the background. Their concern is not Castile, however, who is bleeding to death. It's Reynolds. We got a female passenger, someone states. Giannis barks orders to the chorus arriving at the car. Get the female passenger out. The other officers follow suit with seeming eagerness, as if Reynolds produced the previous standoff, as if she were the one pointing a trigger-ready gun, as if she were responsible for anything other than her blackness captured in the hold of the passenger seat. Ma'am, exit the car with your hands up. Let me see your hands. Exit now. Keep them up. Keep them up. The filming continues as she exits the vehicle. We see the line of police cars, lights flashing. We see an officer with his gun pointed. We see precisely what we have come to expect, Black people in pain. What was unexpected, at the time at least, was the live feed, her act of witness and refusal. Moving between this witness and the immediacy of the situation, Reynolds asks about her 4-year-old daughter, sitting in the back seat throughout and initiated as subject because of her positioning. But the officer orders Reynolds to turn away and walk backward, an instruction meant to reduce the threat she is believed to pose. Reynolds is transformed into agitator, a potentially violent active agent, a criminal who must be controlled. This is the law at work. This is the language of slavery's afterlife. Keep walking, we hear them say. Get on your knees, get on your knees. She obeys, but she also keeps filming. Suddenly our view shifts upward, just as we hear the little girl scream and the sound of handcuffs. Why am I being arrested? Reynolds asks. You're just being detained as we sort this thing out, okay? The subduing officer replies. But there's nothing to be sorted out. We have watched it in real time. Reynolds acknowledges our gazes as she explains, they threw my phone, Facebook, and then transitions into her sadness, the job of witness nearly complete, her refusal to mourn almost at an end. Please, Jesus, no. Please, no. Please, no, don't let him be gone. But he was. His death was evidence of a complete disregard for his humanity, for Diamond Reynolds, her daughter, and everyone else who loved Castile. Now, a few notes on this deadly scene. Stay with me. 3 simple but urgent words that carry a charge beyond what many can understand at a distance. Still, from this distance, most of us watched and listened, often with outrage. Perhaps the outrage was predictable given the impossibility of avoiding Castile's bloody scene, to say nothing of the seemingly clear-cut circumstances that propelled its unfolding. A routine traffic stop, someone Black behind the wheel, a police officer, and the unfettered license to wield force. On the other hand, perhaps the outrage was performative, or better put, misplaced, in that it located the problem at the scene of the crime rather than what produced it, the law. In either case, today's virally infused field of vision ensured that Castile's death was and remains everywhere, plastered across social media, preserved and available on demand. His life, however, is far less vivid. For the most part, we do not encounter Castile as someone having lived at all. His past and present, his aspirations for the future, are all fictive possibilities figured beyond our line of sight. Instead, the portrait we come to know and remember is one of a dying and dead Black male body. This violence underpins the representations of and the discourse around Blackness and the lives of Black people. The parade of murders prior to, during, and immediately after the 2020 uprisings, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, and half a dozen others tell us everything we need to know. When it comes to Black America, America tethers her tongue to the grave, which is to say, as Shatima Threadcraft has observed, to the extent we mount any real political or cultural discussions concerning the Black body and its standing in this country, the body that receives the most attention is a deceased one. One might further conclude that, in the eyes of many, stories concerning Black non-pathologized life have primarily been an afterthought, if not unthinkable, especially when juxtaposed with images of bullet-ridden flesh. The world is conditioned to index Blackness, and therefore Black people, to precarity and premature death. Our pain is naturalized, a matter of course. American history has given Black folks little reason to expect differently. More than 25 years ago, in the aftermath of the Rodney King beating, the poet and scholar Elizabeth Alexander summed up the circumstance with precision. Black bodies in pain for public consumption have been an American national spectacle for centuries. That spectacle remains with us still. Black subjection can be found in physical violence, as in beatings, shootings, lynchings, as well as in what Hartman describes as scenes in which terror can hardly be discerned: on the stage, in the courtroom, behind the blinding letter of the law. It can be found in the statistical imbalance between the life chances and successes of those who have darker skin and those who do not, as well as the prescriptive and demeaning narratives and assumptions that guide policy responses, even when enacted by Black politicians, and inform the logic of uplift and respectability. Finally, it is found on the psychic level, embodied and reproduced in everyday practices and cultural patterns. Yet, it is the physical dimensions of Black subjection that feverishly work to preserve and obscure the entanglement of knowledge and power that helps make this subjection possible. In other words, the spectacle of Black suffering reproduces and is produced by racialized ways of seeing, knowing, and narrating Blackness. This is not a revelation. The cultural and political discourse on Black pathology, Fred Moten notes, has been so pervasive that it could be said to constitute the background against which all representations of Blackness, or even the color Black, take place. As a result, any affirmative notion of Blackness and Black life unfolds out of the world by definition, at least in terms of how it is unseen and misunderstood by those unburdened by Black skin. The implication here is that what actually does unfold in the world, what appears legible, if not expected, is underwritten by the pained and pathologized Black body. After all, as searing as Castile's death was, the shooting itself recounts a familiar story, one that's been amplified in recent years not merely by the volume of similarly wrenching episodes, but the visibility of their repetition. In an essay published the year before Castile's murder, Calvin Warren points out that more than 50 years after the heralded civil rights legislation of the 1960s, we are witnessing a shocking accumulation of injured and mutilated Black bodies, particularly young Black bodies. To this, I would add, most are witnessing this accumulation against their will. Thanks in large part to social media, the routine sight of willful acts of anti-Black violence has become a reality many cannot escape. Stop forcing these videos down our throats, pleads one Black organizer in a note posted on Facebook. Some of us are quite literally still mourning our brothers and don't need constant reminders of the disdain this world had for them while they were still breathing. These videos and images, along with the countless deaths that go underreported, are modern-day slave narratives, different in kind from the past, but no less brutal in their consequence. I call them slave narratives to make the historical trajectory explicit. From the hold of the slave ship to the driver's seat of a car proceeds a persistent and assorted process of subjugation that subsumes Black people in a shroud of vulnerability, threats that hide and wait. It is a process that ensures, as the poet Claudia Rankine put it, the condition of Black life is one of mourning. Beneath this acknowledgement lies a painful reality. Whether authorized by a badge or brought about by vigilantes, anti-Black violence, the naked assault against being Black, is as sedimented and structuring as America's national myths and symbols. Such violence is not an aberration. It is America's condition, a possibility, and the foundation upon which the entire project of Western modernity rests. This is because the underlying logic surrounding post-Enlightenment political thought was, and in material effect continues to be, grounded in a biological determinism that relegates Black people to non-human status, a strategy that differentiates and essentializes human beings by narrating whiteness as the all and everything against the nothingness of Blackness. It is the defining script of white supremacy, its sacred text, and represents what Charles Mills has called the unnamed political system that has made and continues to make the modern world. For example, in 1857, Chief Justice Robert Taney infamously summed up this sentiment when issuing the majority opinion in the often cited Dred Scott v. Sanford case. Black people, opined Taney, are of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Accounts like the one offered by Taney, salacious through the prism of history, demonstrate a broader framework of physical demarcation and meaning-making. This tribal exchange of symbolic inscriptions stretches through and across our most salient political characteristics, the way we read race, gender, sexuality, class, citizenship, ethnicity, and religion. Nevertheless, it has been, for perhaps the last 700 years, most firmly rooted in the same soil: Blackness. The accumulation of dead Black bodies, then, does more than haunt the visual field. It also disrupts any pretense that the arc of history bends towards a better, more just world. The increasingly spectral nature of these deaths, a haunt that appears again and again and again, likewise unsettles the idea that justice and equality are possible while leaving the values, institutions, and techniques that reinforce the capitalist liberal state intact. In other words, the current order of things, the world as we know it, is structurally incapable of genuine care or concern for the actual lived experience of Black people, let alone the mattering of Black life. The long-standing and all-encompassing reality of anti-Blackness, what Christina Sharp calls the weather, requires us to adopt a view geared less towards instances of Black pain as singular events, since doing so only serves to make spectacular that which we know to be routine and by design. Instead, what should become central is the exploration of what that pain generates, what it makes manifest. As Audre Lorde noted during a 1978 interview, pain is important, not merely because it is a fact of life, especially if you are a member of a marginalized community, or in light of the layers of power, seen and unseen, that make the pain of marginalization possible, if not inevitable. The importance rests in the way pain moves us to act, what pain calls on us to do. The fire that moves this movement and has fueled Black rebellion is, in the first instance, harnessed through the burn of Black pain. Online and in the streets, the movement for Black Lives political culture, the movement's demand to defund and abolish the police, is a multimodal response to and an acknowledgement of the wake, the system of signs and symbols, the language that cements the conventions of anti-Blackness in the present and into the future, just as it has been in the past. In that sense, the phrase Black Lives Matter should not be read as a cry for recognition, at least insofar as such calls have generally been fastened to rights-based discourse and efforts towards inclusion and protection. Instead, Black Lives Matter announces something more foundational, even primal, the collective demand for self-possession in the United States and throughout the Black diaspora. Now, I don't mean the self-possession associated with liberal individualism and self-determination, the freedom to determine your future according to pre-prescribed arithmetic of what that future should look like, how one should behave to achieve it, and who is otherwise provided or denied access. I mean self-possession that lays claim to and over the body, to and over space, to and over life, by embracing what Tina Camp calls a practice of refusal. It is a refusal to accept a world that relegates Black people to subhuman status, as an object or as deviant, negations that differently extend across gender, class, and sex. It is a refusal to believe the world as it is will ever permit Black people to live fully, richly, and without threat. As a result, it's also a willingness to, as Camp writes, embrace the labor required to directly engage the precarity of Black life, to use negation as a generative and creative source of disorderly power, to embrace the possibility of living otherwise. For Black lives to matter, then, the dead must be acknowledged to protect the not yet, perhaps soon to be dying as and so they can live. To put it another way, Black Lives Matter underscores the prevalence of Black pain and Black death to Black life. It foregrounds the question of unbearable brutality produced by anti-Blackness and compels us to face the terrifying question despite our desire to look away. But what does it actually look like for Black people to confront unbearable brutality? More precisely, how does one ethically ponder the historical wounding of Black bodies? What does such pondering suggest, speak to, or create? Amid the growing body count and the many images of Black suffering, I found myself watching the video of Castile over and over and over and over again. It was a masochistic compulsion that at the time I found troubling and difficult to understand, especially given that so many around me chose not to watch it at all. But now, following more brutal videos of a Black man forcibly brought to death, I recognize what drew me, the visual and auditory details of the murder, including, yet beyond, the image of his dying body, and beyond Castile himself. One of the most striking and tragic elements of the episode is that Castile was not alone in the car. He was riding with Diamond Reynolds and her 4-year-old daughter. They were present at the moment of his state-perpetrated and state-sanctioned murder, and like Castile, their past, present, and future will forever be subsumed under the weight of his death. Their presence, what they were forced to witness, should make clear that what transpired between Castile and the police officer does not represent the whole or even the most crucial aspect of the story. It's part of the territory's map, not the territory itself, as Sylvia Wynter might say. The live stream and the act of refusal its narration illustrates, despite being trapped in the fruitless logic of right and wrong, are just as central, not only to what took place that day, but to all that lingers in its aftermath, the video included. Whether it's Castile's blood-stained shirt, Emmett Till's mutilated face, or George Floyd's contorted neck, the violent, structural, and systemic force of anti-Blackness remains explicit, for me in profoundly personal ways as a Black man and Black scholar. But more critically and towards my purpose, what matters in the end is how Black people respond, what we do when we reach the point of saying, we're not going to stand for this. The response is crucial to how we read, understand, and theorize Black social movement in the time of Black Lives Matter. It should also inform how we position the politics, thought, and culture of the movement along the grain of the struggle for Black liberation and the strategies used to move Black people closer to attaining it. For centuries, Black activists and thinkers believed that making our pain visible to an anti-Black world would induce empathy, to insist on a public accounting of white violence, a demand that was itself driven by a deep and abiding concern for Black life. As Courtney Baker explains, pain became the currency of Black liberation from injustice and state-sanctioned violence. If only my pain is recognized, I will be free. For example, writing in the late 19th century, Ida B. Wells famously sought to expose the pervasiveness of and impunity for violence against Blacks in the South. Work that was supported by the National Association for Colored Women's Clubs before being taken up by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. To make Black suffering visible, to turn the light of truth on it, she argued, is the way to right wrongs and, in the process, insert Black voices into the channels of public discourse. You could say that her book, The Red Record, and her earlier study, Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in all its phases, were both attempts to demonstrate how a politics of visibility could materially produce change. They were attempts to force the world to reckon with Black pain by advancing a critique of the criminalizing legal and extra-legal regime developed to maintain Black captivity and subordination following the Civil War. The same is true for the open casket funeral Mamie Till Mobley insisted on having for her son Emmett in 1955, as well as the documents of chaos and control, to borrow Baker's phrasings, that archive the repressive response to the civil rights movement's nonviolent direct actions in the early 1960s. But what if the point of attending to Black pain and death is not to induce empathy or recognition, but regard? As a verb, regard means to consider or think of in a specified way. As a noun, to have regard means to give attention to or concern for something. So I'm after the specific way in which we might give attention to and concern for Black pain. The ways that the coherence of spectacular Black death opens up new ways of being and knowing, regardless of how horrible and painful it is. In this vein, the telling of Castile's story is not simply one in a long line of others. It's a political document forged by a Black woman to testify to the irreconcilable chasm between law and justice and direct us to the necessity of engagement this chasm calls forth. Because if the law will not and cannot see or acknowledge Black people beyond our wounded Black flesh, what would it mean to fully see ourselves and, in doing so, recognize what must be done? With these two overlapping definitions of regard in tow, the above questions represent a place where we might begin to reflect on the political importance of sitting together in the pain and sorrow of a death. That is, to see the live stream as a mechanism that makes vivid the underlying violence and vulnerability, the deep-rooted presence of pain that drives Black radicalism and the movement's political culture. Pain, and a regard for it, is the basis from which healing begins, joy manifests, and care gets inscribed as an ethical and political commitment. So to conclude, if Blackness is not simply an ascriptive category, but rather the critical and creative potential for rupture, born out of the tear in the world that was the Middle Passage and colonial conquests, this potential is generated with and through pain. It makes abolition, by which I mean the undoing and remaking of the world, both necessary and urgent. And perhaps that's what exceeds the hypervisibility of premature Black death that I talk about in the book. And what exceeds the specific but by no means exclusive systems and structures of violence that Philando Castile's murder represents, and connects the uprisings of 2020 to what we've seen globally over the past several months in opposition to a genocidal war. Abolition, the letter and language that speaks to the urgency of now, in a moment of sharpening contradictions, but also later when inevitably, for some at least, those sharper edges begin to dull. This, to me, is what it means to build a Black future, what it means to build a Palestinian future, what it means to build a Jewish future, a liberated future, a future for all, where no one, nowhere is forced to wake up to images, let alone the reality of indiscriminate violence and mass death. This is our mandate, to participate in the process of undoing and remaking the world, wherever we are and however we can, embracing the role of fellow architect in the creation of something else, something better, something more. Thanks. Sure.
Questions. If folks would like to ask questions, I'm happy to facilitate that.
Hello, everyone. So my question is, so thinking about building a Black future, and then also, I guess, thinking about what Dr. like Kevin Quashe and what Dr. Ruha Benjamin talk about like a Black world. When you think about the work that you're doing and you're talking about pain and Black joy and Black life, because a lot of times when we say like Black lives, we automatically think of Black death as well. So when you're thinking about your research and like your abolitionist praxis, like how do you acknowledge Black death and Black pain, but then also really focus on Black imagination and like really centering Black folks, but then also thinking about like Black futures. So just want to get your thoughts or your process with that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. For me, you can't think Black life without Black pain. Um, but the point is not to get stuck there. Um, and you could, as I was suggesting, you could replace Black with Palestinian. You could replace it with trans people of any color, right? Acknowledging pain is what moves one to the work. And it's what opens up the ability to see all the possibilities that emanate from Black life or from Palestinian life or from trans life, right? It's what crystallizes the possibility of living in a world that's different than ours. Just the possibility that exists within the way that people live life despite. So, I think, as I was suggesting, I think it's essential to hold that pain as something that galvanizes action and at the same time allows a certain line of sight that might not otherwise be there. And that's what, a Black future would be, right? That line of sight that we might not otherwise see if we just simply accept the world as it is and the conditions that create the possibilities of pain. Cedric Robinson once said, kind of, paraphrasing Marx or going off of Marx, that capitalism and liberal democracy through slavery created its undoing. And so again, when I think about pain, I also think about that, right? The creative destruction that Black imagination and marginalized imagination is possible of doing. It's not inevitable, of course, but it's possible, and that's what I hold on to, at least, and what I hope others do as well.
Thank you. Other questions? President Coley?
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like you to reflect on, as you looked historically, there has always been a effort to keep Black folks uneducated. There's been an effort to marginalize and to have a certain place for Blacks. Talk about the what is your reflection on what's happening across many of the states related to not allowing diversity, equity, and inclusion literature in high schools, in elementary schools, in college, and what the implication is going to be not only for Blacks, but for the multiracial engagement that we are also seeking. There's a movement that I'm old enough to understand when they didn't allow you to read, and now there's a control oftentimes of what should be read or not read. And so can you reflect a little on that, please, in terms of the future?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I mean, we're at the tail end of Black History Month, right? And the Black History Month, or the Negro History Week, how it started, was all about reclaiming a history that was being suppressed. And as you rightly point out, we can see the forces of reaction doing a similar thing now. What I think it signals, or what it should signal to us, is that those forces of reaction are terrified of us. They know that we're coming, and they'll do whatever is in their power to try and stop that. But what's coming is unstoppable, right? It also suggests, though, when we talk about DEI programs, I think we should, even as we see these forces of reaction try and get in the way of Black movement, those efforts in and of themselves are not enough. So we should use this opportunity not just to try and fight to keep the bare minimum in our school systems on every level, but to push past that. We should be done with accepting the bare minimum. We should be done asking for our histories to be told. We should be done with a political system that makes those sort of suppressions possible. So my point on this, or my reflection on this, is why we desperately need abolition. Again, a process of undoing and remaking, not simply so we can argue for the legitimacy of our histories, but so we can use our histories and our imaginations to build a different world. And DEI and those things are not going to do that, right? We have to go way, way past that. But in general, I think what we're seeing is a aging, predominantly white political class frightened about their demise. And we should continue to welcome that frightening and encourage us to fight, again, not just to be able to teach Black history in our schools or Black studies or whatever they misnarrate as critical race theory, but for an abolitionist future. This is why, I mean, people think I'm crazy sometimes. This is why I talk about revolution, not violent revolution per se, or maybe, I don't know, but just the aspiration, right, for something better than this, something beyond this, and the belief that we can have it, that it is our right. If you want to talk about rights, that is our right, something better than this. And so yeah, I mean, the white aging political class is scared of us, and we should laugh at them as we move towards what we know is possible. I hope that addresses the question.
Welcome, Dr. Harris, from another former UCI student and an alum on my part. So there are a number of students here from Introduction to Ethnic Studies, one of many classes across the university that satisfies the California State University requirement for an ethnic studies class. So I'm really glad that my students were able to hear you and hear of your work. I have a couple of requests. One is, would you comment on the issue of voter suppression, specifically as it pertains to African Americans across the country? Two, would you share a little bit about your own academic journey? I'm hoping my students see you directly as a role model for them as they contemplate future graduate school and doctoral programs. And three, could you also share a little bit about the classes you teach at UC Irvine? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So, yeah, voter suppression. God, all my politics are about to come out, if they didn't already. These maneuvers are nothing new, you know, and I think it kind of connects to what I was saying before, that there is a fear of our political power, and it's representative of what I would say is a fading farce of democratic procedure in this country. I think that a combination of things that are happening connected to voter suppression, but like just in terms of the way our quote unquote democracy works, is really crystallizing right now. I mean, this is what I mean by the contradictions being very acute. Right? It's not just the voter suppression, but it was like, okay, even if everyone was allowed to vote, the system itself doesn't present us with real choices, right? And even if it did present us with real choices, we have a political system where, you know, the president and the executive branch could support genocide without our permission. So, I mean, I think when we're focused on just voter suppression, we're like missing how that is part of a larger systematic way of disenfranchising everyone, not just black people, but everyone. And that is the nature of the system itself. It's always been that way. This is why I return to the subject of abolition, right? It's not good, you know, even if the voter suppression was not happening, we still wouldn't be in a democracy. We don't have a democracy. The sooner we recognize that we don't have a democracy, the better we'll be. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't vote or you shouldn't participate or whatever. You do you, right? But, you know, it's not just about voter suppression. It is about the lack of democratic procedure in this country, and that should be something that we're vocal about and fighting for. I mean, I don't think there should be a president, right? I don't think that, our whole system of government needs to be rearranged. And so that's what I think about when I think about voter suppression. Is just an example of why we need to tear it down and build something else. And I hope, I really hope you all see that, right? You know, like it is very acute right now between, I guess, having to choose between, you know, Biden and Trump and, you know, like the two different sides of the capitalist class and the Republicans and the Democrats. These are not options. So, you know, voter suppression to me is just a representation of recognition that people aren't blinded by the propaganda anymore. And that's always been the case, right? You know, voting in this country has always been something that the elites tried to keep from others. So yeah, I don't want to ramble on about that. But so for my journey, yeah. So I had no intention of being an academic. I wanted to be an artist. After college, I was in a band. We were doing it DIY style. We traveled around the country a couple of times, self-released some albums. It's on Spotify. I'm not going to tell you the name of the band, but it's there. It exists. And then, you know, that was a grind, and I hit a wall. You know, the dream of being a rock star started to fade. And then I thought to myself, well, what could I reasonably do, given my disposition? I'm not good with authority. I don't like the idea of a 9-to-5 was just like not it for me. And I was always a bookish type of person. So I figured, hey, why don't I get a PhD? Which is kind of arrogant, maybe. But I didn't even know what that meant, to be honest. But you know, along the way, I figured it out, and I realized that there's something deeply creative about research and writing. There's something deeply invigorating about teaching and being in dialogue, learning from students as much as they learn from me. So in the end, you know, it was almost as if the kind of creative spirit that I had that was driving me to be a musician and a songwriter and singer and all that stuff got, you know, superimposed onto this. And so now this is like a performance to me, right? You know, and like writing or trying to push the limits of what it means to be an academic writer is like writing lyrics, you know. I want there to be some kind of musical quality in what I write and how I talk, and so that's kind of how I got here, which is to say it was a long and winding road, to quote a Beatles song that many of you might not know. And maybe that's really the lesson, right? That, you know, allow the different paths. allow for the possibility of different paths. But while doing so, remain true to yourself. I mean, that's something that I feel like I did, right? I knew that I wasn't going to be an office type. I knew I wanted to do something creative, and I ended up being able to do that. And I'm grateful for that opportunity every day. In terms of what I teach, I teach political ideology. I teach about social movements and revolutions. Surprise. I teach about abolition. Yeah, I mean, I teach everything you've been hearing me say is what I teach basically on the undergraduate level. On the graduate level, we chop it up about political and social theory, which maybe is less interesting to you all, but I try and teach kind of what like as I was suggesting, about our collective responsibility to the world. And to exact that responsibility is to see the world, basically. That's what's so important about the ideologies class, is to understand that everything out here is how we move and how we operate is ideological. And we need to kind of break that down in order to understand what we actually believe and what we actually want. And then to actually go for it. And so that's what's fun to me about being able to teach about ideologies and social movements and revolutions and all that things, to make people believe that another world is possible. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Other questions?
There's such a tremendous history and tradition of voter registration, the Black church, grassroots movements, and what you just said. I found myself slipping into disappointment at first. I wouldn't debate the issue of whether or not we live in a democracy, but my personal belief is it's essential to vote. So I got lost a little bit. So would you comment on the tradition in the African American community over many, many generations to fight for the vote, and you teach political philosophy. I got lost a little bit in some of your earlier comments in response. So I'm just anxious to hear what you have to say about the tradition of voter registration and all that the African American community did to lead in civil rights on the issue that led to the at least the 1965 Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sorry to disappoint in the response to that. I mean, if I can be frank, there is a long tradition in the Black community to fight for the right to vote. And not just fight for the right to vote, but to create schools to teach people literacy so they could pass the test to vote. Right? There is a long and rich history of that. And I don't mean to dismiss it, but I don't believe in this political system. And I'm not going to pretend that I do. And I'm not going to tell you to believe in it or not believe it, but I'm going to be frank about that. And so that's why I say when we talk about voter repression and that kind of a regression, in some ways, that is only one small part of a larger critique that we need to have. And that's about the political system as such. And so, yes, of course, we need to build on the long history of fighting for the right to vote against the forces of reaction that are trying to strip that away. And voting is important because there's real material consequences that come from who we elect. Real material consequences, and it would be, quite frankly, negligent for anybody to say not to vote or to pretend that voting is important, both because of the material conditions but also because the political system is the terrain that most of us understand, or most people understand, where political change happens or where change can happen. And so if you're not navigating that, if you're not like participating in that, then you are not you're gonna not reach people, right? Nonetheless, as much of an issue as voter repression is, and as much as a tradition and history that Black movements drive to expand the franchise, as important as all those things are, I think it's equally important, if not more so, to recognize that we can do better, and that driving to getting us to what did Marx say in the Civil War in France when he was talking about, I mean, maybe you guys don't know this, but like he was talking about the Paris Commune, and he had this line, I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm not going to remember exactly, where he's like, the Paris Commune, instead of electing every 2 or 4 or 6 years people to misrepresent you, they actually instituted a real democracy, which would be to have actual representatives who are accountable and who could be recalled at a given, you know? So I would actually prefer us to talk about the forces of reaction, but also imagine what a real democracy might look like and how we might get there.
Thank you. I am going to ask that we end this formal part of the program, but hoping Dr. Harris will stay and celebrate his book some more with us while we have lunch, and again, just enjoy each other's company this afternoon and think more about how we can do better. I do want to announce there is a flyer on your tables for a new scholarship, the Dr. Humber Memorial Book Scholarship that just opened up this year, and it's thanks to a generous donation from Dr. Renford Reese in the Political Science Department. So please take these flyers with you and help spread the word. We're hoping to get lots of students to apply for this opportunity. And please join me again in thanking Dr. Harris for his wonderful contributions and his time with us today. And lunch is ready, so please help yourselves and network amongst each other. Thank you.